Can we design a sustainable, fair, anti-fragile future that liberates our descendants to live meaningful lives?
Absolutely not. However, what we can do is navigate to such a world. And this, at first, may seem like a very minor difference, but I think actually the difference is major. And when people come to understand it, it will, I hope, free us from certain facile notions that we often pick up and point us in the direction of useful replacements. So what do I mean by that? Those of us who make objects, who think of something and then try to bring it into the world, whether it's a piece of furniture or a machine of some kind, get familiar with the process of prototyping. And a prototype is, on the one hand, a little bit paradoxical if you view it in isolation. So if you make a prototype of some machine that you think would be useful to have, that prototype is liable to be clumsy, it's liable not to be intuitive, it's liable to be inefficient. And so the amount of time and effort that you put into building a prototype tends to far outstrip whatever savings or improvement you would get out of the thing. But that's not really the product of a prototype. A prototype is not designed to solve the problem that it is built around. It is designed to teach you what you don't know so that you can make an object that ultimately will save time and energy or make you more effective at doing something. So what we need to understand is that very often the inventor does not realize enough of a savings or an improvement to justify the massive expenditure in a series of prototypes. The market pays them to do this work by getting a bunch of people to buy the end product. So each of the prototypes may be very expensive in terms of time and resources, but the end product is then something that you can produce many copies of and people will get to use them. If we understood that when we are attempting to structure a society that we are actually involved in the same process, that we should nowhere in our minds have the idea that we know so much about the way human beings function or the way systems are going to interact with human psychology that we can design a system that works really, really well. But instead what we can do is separate the problem into puzzles that we can solve and build a prototype that tells us if we're in the right neighborhood and then teaches us what we don't know about the interactions of certain mechanisms, for example. Then we can get there. So what I've been saying for the last several years is that it is relatively easy, actually surprisingly easy, to figure out what values we should share and therefore what a successful civilization would have to do in order for us to regard it as such. Once we name those values and we figure out some prioritization mechanism so that we can figure out when there are tension between these things, as there always are, in which way that tension should pull, we can begin to prototype a mechanism that returns on those values. It is a navigation problem more than it is a design problem. You do have to design a prototype, but that prototype will reveal the opportunities that you've bypassed, it will reveal flaws in your thinking, and it will allow you to take the next step. And so I would argue that that navigation is almost literal. That we obviously use navigation as a metaphor, but that when we think of an engineer as designing a mechanism, they are basically bringing a physical hypothesis into being. That hypothesis tests their understanding of how the systems interact, and then they bring a next version into being. And it is like traversing design space in an effort to achieve some objective. In building a better civilization, that is what we must do. And the founding fathers of the United States knew this to some extent. They understood that they were not building a final product. They understood that there were things about the future that they couldn't anticipate, and they expected us to modify their experiment a great deal. And we of course can't know, but I suspect they would be shocked at how reluctant we've been to modify their experiment. We have to be a bit more proactive, though. The founders did not know about adaptive evolution. They didn't understand that they were building a system that would evolve over time. And because they didn't understand that, they didn't build in the proper safeguards to deal with the fact that an evolutionary system doesn't necessarily do what you spell out in setting it in motion. It does whatever the niches that it finds dictate that it should do. We have to anticipate that and to realize that many of the niches that the system we build will find are things that we don't want it to discover or exploit. We do not want it, for example, taking advantage of defects in our social architecture. We do not want our governmental structure, for example, to facilitate human beings gaming other human beings. That's something that we would like to stamp out, and we would like it to allow people to explore mechanisms that actually enhance the lives of other people. So we have to recognize that that's not a natural phenomenon, that nature involves creatures exploiting other creatures all the time. If we allow markets to simply explore space, they will discover many things that are valuable and desirable, but they will discover maybe even more things that are net negative for the population. There's no reason to allow markets to dictate what it is that we can do just simply on the basis of whatever is profitable. We have to guide them. We have to effectively take the awesome power that is contained in markets and harness it so that it produces things that are honorable and good and doesn't produce things that are parasitic or destructive. So we've got a navigation problem on our hands. Naming the values that the system should pursue is not so difficult. Most people would agree that we want a system that is safe, sustainable, fair, and that effectively liberates people to choose how to live. That those would be desirable things. People will differ over what priority to give these different values. We have to figure out how to navigate that fairly. So if most people in society prefer a bit more safety, we have to make allowances for that. In other words, we don't want those people who prioritize freedom over all other things to put us all in jeopardy because they have a particular relationship with risk. But we have to figure out how these things are prioritized, how to change those priorities over time as the population changes what it desires. And then we have to navigate to a system that stably generates these things. Human beings are a product of adaptive evolution. We are adapted to the circumstances that our ancestors faced on the way to the present. Those adaptations, many of them are useful still, and some of them are actually an existential threat to our continued survival. For example, we are evolved for population against population competition, and that population against population competition is an existential threat in an era where some populations have large nuclear arsenals, where biological warfare is going to become increasingly accessible at a technological level to smaller and smaller powers. We can't allow a world that is governed by small tyrannical forces that wish to deploy technology against the average citizen. So we have to somehow negate that risk. That risk comes from our built-in competition between populations, our tendency to compete with other populations and to cooperate, therefore, with our own population has been a key to the success of all the populations that exist currently on the Earth today, and it is now an existential threat going forward. So somehow we have to neutralize the tendency of that instinct to control our behavior. And that is going to require us to make sure that the experience that people have, that the world that they see, does not trigger their xenophobia, that it triggers their collaborative instincts. And this is actually a process that has been evolutionarily unfolding for thousands of years, where what once would have been a feeling of affinity for a tiny number of individuals, all of whose names you knew, is now a feeling of affinity for a large population, mostly anonymous to you. So selection has been engineering a sense of shared purpose over larger and larger populations. And we have to take the final step where that sense of shared fate actually extends to all people.
So the future isn't awesome.
Well, our future is not headed in the direction of awesome at the moment, which I realize is out of phase with the conventional wisdom of the moment, that these are the best of times and things are less violent and more prosperous than they've ever been, which there's a certain amount of truth in that. But the problem is, if we separate out the various values that we might pursue, we're doing really well on some and really terribly on others. And unfortunately, the places that we are doing worst have to do with the sustainability of our mechanisms of living and the fragility that we have invited into our system. So, although things are comparatively easy if you are decently positioned in society, you're comparatively good if relative to where an ancestor might have been 100 or 200 years ago. But they are not fair. That is to say, depending upon what population you're born into, your access to opportunity will vary tremendously. So that is something that needs to be corrected. And it is also the case that even if things could be made fair, that we are essentially gambling with the hazards that we face, that the interconnectedness of civilization and the exponential technology that we utilize are putting us in grave danger over the long term. And I think this is one of the most serious problems, is that because our day-to-day existence is relatively easy, I mean, even if you have a rotten job in civilization, the number of hazards that have been taken care of on a day-to-day level is most of them. There are more people, for example, who are obese than starving these days. So the greatest hazard that ancestors would have faced has apparently been taken out of first place. Starvation is not an issue at the moment. But what that means is that somatically we're getting the wrong messages about how secure we are, that our day-to-day lives aren't that difficult, but our long-term prospects are actually not so hot. So effectively we have to address this puzzle. We have to make civilization sustainable, and I would argue that if you made it sustainable, but you didn't make it fair, it wouldn't stick. So essentially we're faced with the puzzle of either finally addressing all of these puzzles together, or building something that might reduce jeopardy of one kind or another, but would only last temporarily.
Well, how can you convince people that it's not sustainable? Because people are kind of programmed to think about how good they have it.
I think this may be the greatest challenge that we've got, is that as long as people are well-fed, they don't tend to believe even robust mathematical analyses that tell us very well that we are burning up resources that are not renewable. And I must say, I think one reason for hope is that we actually may be closing in on viable fusion power. And fusion, unlike fission power, fusion power could potentially plug into all of our systems and allow us lots of leeway to do remarkable things, including reverse global warming, if we can scale it up.
Like suck the heat out of the air?
Not suck the heat out, but suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. So fusion power offers a great deal of hope, but if we deploy it without figuring out the other puzzles, then we run the danger of just amplifying injustices in the system that will ultimately destabilize us or will cause a massive burst in consumption that will cause one generation to feel suddenly very well off, but its descendants will be faced with an even more precipitous problem.
Well, how should we ascertain fairness? And because we've both seen how fairness can be used abusively.
Yeah.
Calls for fairness. How do we accurately gauge that?
Well, this is one of these places where there is room for reasonable people to disagree over, let's say, how unequal outcomes can be and still be tolerated. But I don't think there's any room for reasonable people to disagree over the distribution of opportunity. That all of us, if we are honest brokers who are interested in the well-being of the entire population, should be interested in seeing opportunity as broadly distributed as possible. And we can easily detect that opportunity is not evenly distributed because schools differ in quality, because zip codes differ in the degree to which they prepare you for adult life. So once we get close to fairness, it will be a lot harder to answer that question.
Okay.
But I think we have far enough to go that it's not so difficult.
Isn't like arriving at fairness in a sense a redistribution of advantage, not necessarily wealth, but advantage? Like there will be losers because there are winners now in this system, or can you convince people that everybody's going to be a winner?
Well, that's why I like this formulation. The fact is, I believe that an adult perspective has to recognize that you will have differences in outcome based on how dedicated individuals are. Some people may prefer to go spend time on the beach and be willing to live in a smaller house to do so, and I frankly couldn't tell them that they were wrong to make that choice. That's a valid set of priorities. On the other hand, opportunity has been hoarded by certain populations, and it does so for a reason, which is to say it is rational to keep other children from having the advantages that your children have. That provides your children a head start in life over their competitors. So I can understand the desire to do that. It's rational. It's immoral, but it's rational. What I cannot abide is anybody who argues that it is defensible to deny some people opportunity and then hold them responsible for the outcomes in their lives. Either we all have equal opportunity and then we can be held accountable for the outcomes in our lives, or we don't have equal opportunity, in which case we have a responsibility to people who were denied opportunity to take care of them. It seems to me that you end up in one of those two places inevitably, and I would far prefer to see people liberated to produce great stuff, to see them empowered to do it. And then if some people want to take it as leisure time and other people want to dedicate themselves to the project and they're willing to endure the consequence of living in very different circumstances, that's fine by me.
Well, but then their children will then suffer their choices, and
Well,
then there will eventually be unfairness again in the system.
there can be, but what I don't want to see is yes, if your parents decided to recover the fraction of civilization's surplus that they were due and they want to take it as leisure, and you're the child of somebody who has prioritized leisure and you prioritize accomplishment, it can't be so far out of range that you can't get there from the house you were born into. So I do think civilization has an obligation to make opportunity available to those who wish to use it.
Kind of like an open-ended opportunity. Like every generation, every new life is given a fair shake.
That seems preposterous at one level, but when you think about the vast fortunes that we spend on frivolous stuff, it doesn't seem so far out of range to me. But we spend $120 billion a year on text messages.
Wait, what?
$120 billion a year on text
But
messages.
they're only like 140 characters.
In fact, they're free to the telecoms because they are transmitted on the signal that your phone uses to keep in touch with the tower. They're not even transmitted over the main bandwidth. But we we charge you something like $1,500 per megabyte to send text messages, where that same megabyte would cost cents if you send it over email. It makes no sense to us at all. But the point is, because it's a small part of our bill, we don't even notice that huge expenditure. So my point would be, if you took things that are really not essential and really not useful and productive, and you repurposed a small amount of the resource that we dedicate to those things to human well-being and opportunity, so that a child was born into, even a child is born into a defective family, they deserve for the structures that they encounter in school to provide them the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? The family I came from doesn't speak for me. I want to do something different. Yeah. Why would we ever deny a child the ability to rise above their parents' compromised values if that's what they want to do?
Taking that text message example, and following it a little bit, somebody in a company was paid money to increase the value of that company for the shareholders. So they expended their time and energy to game this little tiny system and then generate this huge amount of profit. How do you incentivize people whose job it is to maximize shareholders and the whole system is rigged so that the shareholders are expected to get more return on their investment? How do you fix that whole system with the text messaging example that generated this huge amount of wealth that doesn't even matter to anything? It's more money. And how do you tax that? These people whose job it is to create more wealth, is that where you tax?
Well, this is where I say it is a mistake to descend into the policy layer prematurely. My point would be, our whole system is broken, and if you want to solve the expenditure on text messages a la carte, then people will scream bloody murder that you're interfering with their opportunity rather than somebody else's opportunity. Why are you going after text messages rather than the porn industry?
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, it's an impossible puzzle to solve. But the point I want to make is not about text messages being the source of revenue to solve the problem of failing schools. My point is, do you realize how many activities that are almost totally frivolous we invest huge sums of money in? And my point is not that some particular thing is the place to recover that revenue. My point is, we have a system that generates absolutely immense abundance and then wastes it. And my point would be, you could take some of that abundance and you could turn it into opportunity for people who are trapped in a system that's going to keep them perpetually hobbled, and then hold them responsible for, hey, did you make use of the opportunity or didn't you? If you had a good opportunity and you squandered it, I think we can afford to be less sympathetic. But if you didn't have the opportunity, not being sympathetic is just simply inhumane.
Okay. What you were talking about earlier is suspending the policy argument and getting to some sort of foundational understanding so that we can start to understand the tools that we need to solve these problems on a conceptual level or a narrative level. That would include some sort of understanding, some sort of ethical understanding of human beings, some sort of sympathetic understanding of other people.
We, unfortunately, because of the situation that our ancestors found themselves in, are overly focused on us as individuals. The experience of being an individual is very compelling, right? It's neurologically compelling. But it's actually an accident. It's an accident of the fact that your ancestors didn't have the ability to affect things far from them or distant into the future. And so you are focused on those things, not that are important, but those things about which you have the potential to make useful interventions. And so human beings are focused on their individuality. We should be focused on the fact that we are hurtling around the sun on a small rock in which we are interconnected in ways that make us fragile and could deny potential future human beings from ever getting the experience to live here on Earth and to enjoy the fruits of our ancestors' labor. That's stupid. We really, it sounds trite, but if you can just tune in just for a moment to the idea that what unites us actually far exceeds what divides us, and that we live in an era where our technological sophistication makes us capable of producing a surplus that could effectively free every person to live well and do useful stuff.
We need education to understand how powerful we are, and that means that we can affect the future and the space that we share much greater than our ancestors could.
Absolutely.
And so we need to upgrade our understanding, which would include like just a broadening of our awareness of how powerful we are.
We need to upgrade our software. And the fact is, upgrading our software is something humans have done again and again. And, you can look at religious texts and you can see them as upgrades, sequential upgrades that increase what people are capable of properly navigating. And what we need essentially is the first upgrade that is aware of what it is. That it is aware that what it is doing is changing our understanding of our own place in history and our responsibility to each other, and in particular our responsibility to future inhabitants of the planet. That we are both in a greater position to damage their birthright and in a greater position to understand in what way we might protect it. And that carries responsibilities, which is the downside. But again, the hardest part to compel people of, but the one that I think is most important, is were we to take that project seriously? Were we to look around the planet and say, actually, you know what, I'm wired to be suspicious of people from other populations, but once I get over that, and once I see history for what it is, and I see my own role for what it is, that actually the project that we've been handed, that the living generations have been handed the greatest project of all time, the most rewarding, the most heroic, exactly. It is heroic. Imagine for a second that you happen to be alive at the moment that humanity is going to rise to some kind of collective consciousness and take responsibility for making the future really, really good, right? Now, if a utopian said that, you should be very frightened, right? A utopian who speaks that way is in danger of architecting something very dangerous. This is why I'm saying it's really important to stay away from utopian ideas at all costs. I'm not telling you I know how to take ownership of our responsibility for the future, but I do know in what direction it is, right? That responsibility is the result of a process of discovery.
So what I get from you about utopia and why you find it problematic is that it imagines an end which is static, and you want to put the focus on the process. The end isn't the goal, the process is the goal. You're looking for a healthy process, which I guess would be more evolutionary. You see something as a dynamic that will constantly need to be adjusted.
It will need to be adjusted. It must be enlightened.
What do you mean by enlightened?
It must be aware of what it is that is being maintained. And what it is that is being maintained is not so difficult. The fact is, if you think about a jetliner from the perspective of the Wright brothers, the idea that you would have this pressurized capsule that flies high enough so that the air is so thin that exposed to it for even a minute you'd black out, but that we can maintain the pressure, we can maintain the temperature, we can maintain an orientation in the jet stream enough that the pilot will know where the plane is and can put it down with precision reliably enough that hundreds of people will step off and collect their baggage and go on about their business. That's hard to imagine from the perspective of the Wright brothers, given what they were dealing with in their early prototype.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's all doable, right? The airplane isn't infinitely complex. It is complex enough to maintain the various feedbacks so that you never get on an airplane and, have the temperature drop to 20 degrees. It just doesn't happen.
If the Wright brothers had, with their current understanding of technology or what they were trying to do, locked their entire project and all future aircraft into this one conception that they had right there, that would be kind of utopianism. Like, we are going to do this, and damn reality, this is what's going to work. But instead, they're like, okay, what we need to do right now is get this thing off the ground. That's all we're going to concentrate on, just getting this thing off the ground and sending it a mile.
Bingo.
Okay.
Bingo. And, Think about it. I mean, it's the perfect example, right? 1903, the Wright brothers finally get enough stuff right to get off the ground long enough to say heavier than air flight has been accomplished. 1903. 1969, we land human beings on the moon, they play golf, and fly home. Okay? That's a pretty short run from getting off the ground for 30 seconds to landing on the moon and playing golf.
Yeah.
Right? It's a pretty short period of time.
And all that stuff, and everything that was generated from that was inconceivable to the Wright brothers. All that aluminum, all that fuel, all the different subsidiary technological advancements required just to get this thing to keep on going forward.
They couldn't have seen it coming. On the other hand, if you look at what they could see coming, the Wright brothers were able to do an amazing amount between 1903, when they got off the ground for the first time, and 1909, for example. All of the people who were trying to discover how to make heavier than air flight had the same set of problems to solve. And really, it was a set of things. You needed an engine powerful enough. You needed the engine to be light enough. You know, all of the powerful engines were heavy because it wasn't so hard if you had wheels under them to deal with the weight of them, so they needed to get the engine light, they needed to get it efficient, they needed to get the control of the aircraft good enough that it didn't squander energy in turning and staying stable, and they needed the airfoils to be aerodynamically efficient. All of those things had to be right in order to get off the ground the first time. Once they got off the ground the first time, they knew more. They were the world's leading experts in aviation. And so, having gotten off the ground the first time, it was clear what direction to head. Getting off the ground the first time required intuition about how to solve all of those little puzzles. They had to make an engine that was light enough. They had to get it efficient. They had to get the control of the airplane down, which they didn't have right at first. They used this wing warping thing, which was pretty inefficient. But the wind tunnel was designed so that they could see the cross sections of wing that were most effective in the wind. And they were, in some sense, I think it was luck. I don't know that they knew that this would be the case. Some things don't scale. There are lots of things that if you make a small version and it works, and then you just scale it up, it'll fall apart.
Kind of communism, maybe?
Bingo. Yes, communism. Well, there's a famous aviation example of this, actually. Langley's Aerodrome. So Langley...
Sounds like a battle, like a WWF battle or something.
Well, Langley was a military guy, and he was trying to win the competition to make heavier than air flight first, and he had a toy called the Aerodrome that flew heavier than air flight, but it didn't carry a person. And so, anyway, he scaled this toy up to immense size, and he invited the press. So there's actually film of this, and he launched it off this barge, an elevated barge, and the thing launched off the barge and literally crumbled into the sea, right? And it's a very dramatic failure, and the only thing that was wrong was that he didn't realize that he had a non-scalable design, that he would have had to modify it substantially. So anyway, the Wright brothers were correct that you could check an airfoil at small size and discover how it would function in the wind at large size.
Yeah.
They also prototyped a lot of stuff at full size, right? So all of the practice that they did over several summers at Kitty Hawk involved full-size prototypes that they flew in the wind. Sometimes they flew them as kites, then they flew them as gliders, then ultimately they flew them as an airplane. So they were doing work at full scale, and they were doing work in miniature, and the two things combined beautifully.
The thing is about a society, though, that it's so complex that there's not going to be any person that's going to understand even one whole of like the project that they're working on, like healthcare or any other given thing. How do you develop in a society trust across all these different expertises?
It involves alignment, and part of the problem that we face is that we are not yet enough aligned to trust each other. But there are, I think we would have to borrow from ancient wisdom in terms of how to align ourselves. But frankly, what I've seen in the last 9 months suggests that there is a hunger for people who are authentic to attempt this job. And what surprised me most is that many people who are quite aware that they don't agree with me politically are still listening, because at some level I think they detect that really patriotism is the core parameter. That there's a big difference between listening to somebody who you disagree with but who you believe is fundamentally ready to sacrifice for the same cause, and therefore you know that their disagreement is actually motivated not by self-interest or something, but by a difference in their understanding of how to achieve some shared goal. If we can get to that page where we can say, hey, we all agree in the experiment, we all agree that the objectives are these, and we disagree over what will lead us to those objectives, then we can have a rational conversation. If you suspect that people are actually advocating for their own interests while pretending to be trying to solve a societal puzzle, then you tend to, lock down whatever you have control over so that it can't be accessed by those people you don't trust. So anyway, we do have to keep people who are not trustworthy away from power.
There needs to be some sort of wind tunnel for authenticity then.
That's a great point. Yeah, a wind tunnel for authenticity, that'd be cool. Yeah, now we can make a wind tunnel to test for toupees. But I don't know that's probably not the same.